There is this sort of sense at the moment of an end of empire moment. Are we living in an end of empire moment? And trying to think clearly about that with the benefit of world history is really the key point of this live stream, what I really wanted to focus on and spring off from a recent piece I wrote on Substack, which was called Is Ukraine the West's Suez Moment? This is something that really was prompted by an article in The Economist magazine, which asked exactly that question. And I'll read you the said passage in The Economist magazine that asked this question. It was in the little section of The Economist called Charlemagne, sort of like a pseudonym type for one of the editorial writers. And it said, to ask what if Ukraine loses was once a tactic favoured by those looking to berate its Western allies into sending more money and weapons. Okay. Increasingly, the question feels less like a thought experiment and more like the first stage of contingency planning. After a grueling few months at the battlefield, gone are last year's hopes of a Ukrainian counteroffensive that would push Russia back to its borders and humble Vladimir Putin. These days, it is fear that dominates. And then the fear comes out. A defeat of Ukraine would be a humbling episode for the West. This is The Economist speaking, the sort of establishment Anglo-American newspaper founded, I think, by Walter Bagot in the 19th century, and very much kind of a cheat sheet almost for the business, government, media elite in so many Western countries. But I digress. It goes on. A defeat of Ukraine would be a humbling episode for the West, a modern Suez moment. So what does that mean, a Suez moment? But of course, it's referring to the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Britain, France, and Israel combined together, but primarily on the instigation and planned by Britain, they effectively invaded Egypt. Now, of course, Egypt, for, 70-odd years, had been a de facto colony of Britain. In the 1920s, it was given a kind of pseudo-independence following World War I, but that was very much a pseudo-independence. Britain still called the shots, and after World War II, Britain still had a kind of a puppet sort of king in Egypt who sort of supported Britain, and in particular supported Britain's military base and commercial interests in the Suez Canal, which the Prime Minister who sent those British troops into 1956 into Egypt in 1956 described as the windpipe of Britain's empire. Obviously, crucial navigation route between Britain and its economic, the jewel in the crown of its empire, India, or Bharat, that is. And Britain, France, and Israel all went into the Suez Canal, and it had really followed, 10 years of decline and a little bit of humiliation for Britain. First of all, even more than 10 years, it really dates to the great imperial crisis for Britain in 1939 to 1942, the start of World War II, where they were threatened in Europe and in the homeland, of course, but they also lost a lot of their interests in Asia in 1942, very decisively for the history of Australia. Singapore fell, the impregnable fortress, the British Empire at Singapore. And with that, the sort of a lot of the British interests in Asia were threatened. The 1939-1942 period is really described by the historian of the British Empire, who will come back as the sort of abyss, the darkest moment of the collapse, effectively, of the British Empire. And after then, it's sort of Winston Churchill in particular is really fighting World War II in order to keep that British Empire going for a few more generations, but ultimately without success. And then at the end of World War II, Britain loses in 1947. India goes as well. China, as does America, with the revolution in 1949, the formation of the People's Republic of China, and the long-term beginning of the end of all the treaty ports and those sort of arrangements. And what's more, Britain is in a complete financial mess by this point. It had already, during World War I, become deeply, deeply indebted to the United States, and in many ways it was, World War I, where really the baton of, world hegemon passed, if that title ever really belonged to Britain. But America, United States of America, really became the sort of a super state of the world after World War I, when obviously the European empires, several of them were knocked out completely. Austria-Hungary, Germany, monarchical Germany, imperial Germany. Russia became, the Russian Empire became the Soviet Union, and had a very different stance on the world. And Austria-Hungary, did I mention Austria-Hungary? Anyhow, so all those sort of things were going on, but Britain and France were still strong to some degree, but financially indebted to the United States. And then in World War II, that gets even worse. And it's really only through America that Britain's lifted off its knees. But the elites in Britain, of course, did not like that. They still believed that the British Empire had decades of life left into it. And this was the view of Winston Churchill and the other subsequent leaders of Britain, going forward to Anthony Eden, who was the Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis in 1956. But what they found was, there were three newly christened superpowers in the world: Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Of those three, by a long, long way, Britain was the weakest. It still had imperial interests, but they were unwinding all over the place. Egypt, in the early 1950s, went through a kind of a political revolution in the beginning of more nationalistic independence. Similar things were happening in other Asian colonies of, dominions of Britain. And places like Australia were still emotionally and socially and culturally deeply linked to Britain in a world before the internet. It could hardly be any other way. But they were strategically more ambiguous about Britain, because Britain had let Australia down at Singapore in 1942, and it was really only America that saved Australia in the Pacific War. So I'm sort of rambling here a little bit, but the point is that the Brits still fancied themselves an empire and a match with the United States. And one of their frustrations was around the British currency. They didn't like the Bretton Woods Agreement, and they dreamt of sort of freeing themselves of that and freeing themselves of the diplomatic and financial and military sway of the United States. And it was in that context of these British elites who really wanted to be back in the top seats of the world that the fiasco of the Suez Crisis happened. And the precipitating event was debates around the Aswan Dam, financial aid from the United States for Egypt's economic redevelopment, and also the establishment of, or the maintenance of a major military base in the Suez Canal. Now, that was not just there to control the Suez Canal. The reason Britain wanted to do that was to be the regional hegemon in the Middle East, what we would now know as West Asia and North Africa. It wasn't just about controlling the access routes or controlling the oil that was passing through the Suez Canal. It was actually about both real power and perceptions of power for Britain as the regional hegemon in this part of the world, to show that it could be a force to be reckoned with. And what's more, this part of the world's quite a long way from Britain, and a very long way from India. And by the 1950s, of course, Britain no longer controlled India. There was a disastrous partition in 1947, which caused, was a disgrace, British imperial failure, and a human tragedy in many ways. What the significance of the Suez Canal base also was, in Britain's eyes, was it was a southern base to attack southern Russia. Yes, even then, even back then, as part of the Suez Crisis, the long-held British distaste for Russia was sort of making itself felt. And I sort of went into these issues to some degree in my article in the Substack. But what I also did during the week was actually just check this book here by Odd Arne Westad, The Cold War, A World History, to look at what it said about the Suez Crisis. And it was quite fascinating, really. Odd Arne Westad's description of the Suez Crisis. And one of the things he pointed out that I have not really noticed terribly much in some of the commentary on YouTube about the Suez Canal crisis, and some of the commentary, on geopolitics channels and things like that, like the Duran, which tend to, buy into the idea that the Suez Crisis was the end of empire moment for Britain, rather than, if you like, the moment when the world realised that the British Empire, the British Emperor, had no clothes. But one of the things I really didn't realise was the Suez Crisis really was a bit of a follow-on event from the famous Bandung Conference in 1959. Now, the Bandung Conference was the first major international conference of the non-aligned movement. If you like, it was a little bit like the BRICS of the 1950s. It was separate from the Soviet Union, to some degree also separate and a little bit suspicious of China, even though China wanted to be along, because China was, a communist power at that point, a communist state at that point. But it was really trying to take the world away from a world of two ideological blocks in conflict, away from a bipolar world, away from the Cold War. And the three driving countries, the three driving leaders in countries in the Bandung Conference in 1955 were India, President Nehru of India, or Prime Minister Nehru, Sukarno from Indonesia, and Nasser from Egypt. And it's really with the wind in his sails from Bandung that Nasser goes forward and takes some of the actions that he does in 1956 that so angered Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Britain that he decided Nasser had to go. Yes, even in the 1950s, Western leaders were planning regime change operations when leaders in other countries sort of got in the way of their interests. And so it leads to this extraordinary conflict where Nasser is consciously summoning the sort of anti-colonial movement of the 1950s as part of the Suez Crisis. So the Suez Crisis wasn't all just about decadence in the metropolitan empire. It was about a new assertiveness, a new set of relationships, a shifting balance of power across what was even then a multipolar world in the 1950s. What I also discovered here was that, of course, one of the central parts of the drama of the Suez Crisis is that Britain really cocked up, basically. I don't know if I'll get into trouble with YouTube to say that particular word, but it's not that bad a word. It was an absolute fiasco. So what happened was Britain sent in its forces. Within days, they were forced to withdraw. And that was in part because there was a run on the British currency, the pound or the sterling. And that financial weakness that had been there for Britain for really decades, but certainly since 1945, and which they resented mightily. They resented the dominance of the US dollar. That financial weakness was exposed. And the United States were furious about it. They also felt that Britain was trying to do all this in the context of the 1956 US presidential election, which has strange resonances with our current time. But as President Eisenhower, who was then the President of the United States, said that he was enraged. He'd been completely kept in the dark about the plans of his allies, and now he felt that he had just never seen great powers make such a complete mess and botch of things. Now, this is where perhaps there's this unwitting truth in what people say about this being the loss in Ukraine being the West's Suez moment, because it certainly is a complete mess and botch of things. But in this case, it's not Britain who's really botched things, although Britain has certainly been one of the more energetic supporters of, high levels of intervention in Russia and Ukraine, but it has been the United States policy. Absolutely what's happened in Ukraine since 2014 and earlier has the United States fingerprints all on it. Nothing they could possibly do is really going to conceal the fact that this is the case. So the question is then, is the defeat in Ukraine revealing the weakness of US power, the constraints on US power, the financial weakness of US power, and also the declining military strength of the United States as well? One of the things that was also interesting here, of course, was the Suez Crisis happened at the same time pretty much as the sort of Russian invasion or, entry into Hungary to sort of maintain the sort of pro-Soviet regime in Hungary. A dramatic event, tanks in Budapest, all that sort of thing. It was a matter of absolute fury that there was this apparent hypocrisy between the old colonial powers, deciding to send armed forces into their proxy colonies or their pseudo-colonies, and the United States proclaiming its belief in national self-determination, the principles of the United Nations and all that sort of thing. So the Suez Crisis sort of undermined the moral authority of the West in many ways, and certainly it undermined the moral authority of Britain. But it also exposed some of the limitations of Cold War thinking. And Odd Arne Westad in The Cold War, A World History, which is a really excellent reference if you're wanting to understand, the real context of current events. Odd Arne Westad says, he quotes the President or Prime Minister of India, I'm not quite sure what his position was. I think it's Prime Minister. I think it was Prime Minister Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru. He quotes him as saying in the Indian Parliament in the context of the Suez Crisis. So this is a voice from India in the 1950s, this era where we're told it's a bipolar world and the world's just divided between, the evil empire of the Soviet Union and the free world led by the United States of America. He says the use of armed forces by the big countries, while apparently achieving something, it has really showed its inability to deal with the situation. It is the weakness which has come out. And there is a sense in which there is a truth there about the nature of what's happened in the West's Suez moment in Ukraine. He carried on with the greatest danger which the world is suffering from is this Cold War business. It is because the Cold War creates a bigger mental barrier than the Iron Curtain or brick wall or any prison. It creates barriers of the mind which refuses to understand the other person's position, which divides the world into devils and angels. And that is very much the kind of mental world of the, what was happening in the 1950s with the growing kind of crusading character of American anti-communist rhetoric and geopolitics, the CIA, the McCarthyism, and the general refusal to even recognize the People's Republic of China at that point. The bloody Chinese, Eisenhower described them as. He was frustrated with Britain in the midst of the Suez Crisis because he felt Britain wanted to, go easy on economic sanctions against China that the United States was implementing. Some things, it seems, almost never change. It just shows that our world has always been multipolar, and we just need to look behind some of these, dividing the world into devils and angels, into democracies and autocracies, because it really gets in the way of seeing what's really happening in the world more clearly. Now, the other great thing about the Suez moment is, or the Suez Crisis and the Suez moment in the memory, particularly of British elites, is it's a sign of imperial failure. A lot of the blame was sheeted home to Anthony Eden of being sick and a bit silly, and not having, I guess, maybe the strength of will, the strength of character to really see through the crisis properly. One of the other things I discovered in my exploration of the Suez Crisis is through this book here by John Darwin, The Empire Project. And I quote this in my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. in the essay, is Ukraine the West's Suez moment? And I'll just quickly read for you what he says, because he says a lot of people felt that Britain learned a lesson in the Suez Crisis, but that really was not so. In the long-term perspective, we can all see that it was the moment when the weakness of Britain was brutally exposed to the world, just as perhaps these last couple of years in Afghanistan and Ukraine and Yemen and Gaza, the weakness of the United States is being exposed. But what John Darwin, who is really the greatest of British historians of the British Empire, and not just the British Empire, but of all the empires of the world over the last 600 years, his magnificent book, After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires 1400 to 2000, is absolutely essential reading. And I'm actually doing a course at courses.jeffrichwriter.com on the rise and fall of empires that's going to start in June. And it really uses John Darwin's book as the spine to take you through over 12 weeks the true history of the rise and fall of empires, so that you can actually base your assessment of what's going on in today's world, whether this is in fact an end of empire moment, whether America is in decline, whether we are still in a unipolar world or in a multipolar world. You can base your assessment, your independent thinking about that on something more than just, tired old stale analogies with the Roman Empire that is, after all, one case of an empire, and not even a very clearly understood case in most cases. So John Darwin's book says that you would think that after such a catastrophe, people would sort of learn the lesson of foreign policy failure rather better, that they might have learned something from the fiasco. But he says the most curious aspect of the British reaction to Suez, once the immediate drama had passed, was the mood of public indifference. There was no grand debate about Britain's place in the world, no official inquiry into what had gone wrong. But what seems even more curious is that after such a defeat, British leaders still showed an extraordinary faith that with its sails duly trimmed, Britain must remain a world power. And, wow, have we had a proper inquiry after Afghanistan? Have we had a proper set of reflections or self-doubts after Afghanistan? And will we see the same after Ukraine? I've seen John Mearsheimer say on like the Duran and other great geopolitics channels that, at some point people are going to ask what went wrong and want to blame someone. But I guess perhaps the very saddest lesson of the Suez Crisis is that might not happen. You would think after all the tragic failures in Ukraine, and as they become more apparent, even in the last few days, as money's been voted into, to support Ukraine, but the press is full of the fact that, well, it might only last a couple of months. You'd think that there would be some sensible voices calling for a genuine assessment after the catastrophic failure there. But was there one after Afghanistan? Was there one after Libya, after Syria, after Iraq, will there be one after Gaza? And will there be one after Ukraine? Or will we not just see the same kind of public indifference and the same kind of muddling through an elite? And this makes me say at the end of my Substack piece that the last sad lesson of the Suez moment is that usually when great powers fall catastrophically, the ship of fools still sails on. So, Suez moments and end of empire moments. I think one of my reflections on a lot of the discussion of the end of empires moments, which, you see a lot around at the moment, is a lot of the American-based discussion of end of empire is very inwardly focused. It's all about, decaying infrastructure and, bad politics and, spendthrift lifestyles and all that kind of thing. And what it doesn't really directly acknowledge all that much, or, a catastrophically bad health system, which seems to be, the one truth of American exceptionalism is its catastrophically bad health system. But the one, what was I saying? A lot of the discussion from American-oriented sort of, American-based channels. I watched, a relatively good one earlier on today about the sort of end of empire sort of moment, but I can't quite remember who produced it. But it was very much about the weaknesses of American domestic government. It doesn't really squarely face and acknowledge the changing balance of power, the changing flows of resources, power, ideas, people around the world. And ultimately, it's that new pattern, if you like, of globalization, the changing tides of globalization that are leading to a change in America's disposition to the world. I think my other big reflection about all of this is that end of empire moments, people too often have two comparisons really in mind: a very simplistic, let's say, or oversimplified understanding of what happened at the end of World War II, the transition from the European colonial empires to the world of the United Nations, of America leading a free world of self-determined nations, all equal under international law. Of course, that didn't really happen quite that way, nor was there a simple peaceful transition of the British Empire to the American Empire or the American Republic. That was a much, much more vexed sort of situation. And so there tend to be that comparison with the sort of end of the British Empire, assuming that there was a world hegemon and Britain and America won World War II and then, handed peacefully control of the world to the United States as like a father and son sort of business. And that is really not true. And it's not true as demonstrated, if nothing else, than by the Suez moment, the Suez Crisis, where Britain is resentfully clinging on to its power, its status as a great power, and would continue to do so for another 15 years or so, and in some ways still does, in many ways, still has this sense of itself as, punching above its weight in the world, of being a global power and, the world's greatest intelligence assets and all the rest of it, James Bond's fantasies. So that's one example. And the other example is Rome. And, there are so many different interpretations of the Roman Empire. So empires generally, there have been so many empires in the world, and that's one of the themes of John Darwin's books, that generally in world history, empires have been the rule of the road. And so that means there have been many, many different cases of empires waxing, waning, recovering, changing their pattern of rule, changing their pattern of influence, changing their pattern of dominion. So I think it's really it tends to be a bit of a neat way of encapsulating a narrative into a very traditional form. The end of empire moment, the collapse of Rome, yet again, the sapping of the moral strength for Rome by a moral corruption of whoever is the target of your opprobrium within America. That is a really simplistic model. Empires tend to last a lot longer. The process of decay sort of is much more complicated than that.